Hello, everybody. I'm Jackie Williams with Montgomery Heart and Wellness. Our guest tonight is Dr. Peter Rogers. Dr. Rogers is a Harvard-trained and Stanford-trained physician with over 30 years of clinical experience, specializing in neuroradiology and image-guided procedures. He is a passionate advocate for whole food plant-based nutrition. And Dr. Rogers is known for promoting what he calls Spartan Veganism, a low-fat, SOS-free, that's no salt, no oil, no sugar diet focused on reversing chronic diseases such as heart disease, diabetes, and dementia. Drawing from both scientific research and personal experience, he emphasizes the critical role of nutrition in preserving brain health and cognitive function. Dr. Rogers is the author of several books, including The Poor Man's Way to Prevent Dementia and Raise IQ, and he regularly shares his expertise through public lectures, YouTube interviews, and podcast appearances. He has been featured on platforms such as Be Green with Amy, where he discusses topics ranging from dietary fats and dementia prevention to plant-based performance and disease reversal. Dr. Rogers combines medical rigor with practical guidance, making him a compelling voice in the field of lifestyle medicine and nutritional healing. A quote from Dr. Rogers: "For those who want to learn and improve their health, there is a way. The true secret is that one should change what one eats from a high-fat Western diet to a plant-based diet full of whole grains, vegetables, and fruits." All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Rogers, for being here. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right. So you have a presentation tonight about how to prevent dementia, which is
Yes.
very important.
Yeah. Would you like me to start?
Yes, please.
Okay. So let me go and get my slides ready to go here. Okay. And then I got to share the screen. Okay. So I'm sharing my screen and now here's my slide. Can you see my first slide?
Yes, again.
Okay, so the first slide here, this is a picture of Annette Larkins. She's considered the most beautiful grandmother in the world. She's 70 years of age in this picture. She lives in Florida with her husband, and her husband owned like a delicatessen butcher shop, and she found it kind of disgusting, the smell of all the meat, so she became a vegan, only eating plant foods. And what's interesting about this, they're both about 70. He looks like the typical patient, overweight, probably hypertensive, probably diabetes, probably coronary artery disease, and all those problems. Whereas she looks fantastic. She looks, in between 35 to 40 years of age. Okay. So, not everybody gets this good of results, but it is true that people who eat the low-fat vegan diet, they almost always maintain a healthy body weight, and they're very unlikely to get hypertension or type 2 diabetes. If you've had hypertension for a couple of decades, it's harder to fully reverse it. Sometimes you can. Same thing with diabetes. If you still have intact insulin production in the pancreas, you can reverse it, but the sooner you get going on it, the better. Okay, so I just wanted to show you the typical situation with these populations. This is the Nauru. There are people that live on an island near Australia. Back in 1914, they grew food on their island, and they also did a little bit of fishing, but they primarily grew food on their island. They're skinny, they're healthy. And then the corporations came in, and the tropical birds would defecate on the island land. And there's a lot of phosphate in there that the corporations wanted to take for fertilizer. So they made a deal with the rulers of Nauru. They would give them a lot of money if they could take their topsoil, and they did that. For a while, the Nauru was the richest country in the world. But then in order to give them food, because they could no longer grow food on their island, they had to ship in all this processed food. And they became the fattest people in the world with an average body weight of 230 pounds, okay, with off the charts, obesity, diabetes, hypertension. So a cautionary tale, you want to eat real plant foods that grow, right out of the land. And this processed food is terrible for you. Okay, what's the most common cause of death in Black people? Processed food. Okay, it's off the charts. People have no idea how much toxic stuff is in this food. Besides being high fat, high sodium, it's low fiber, low potassium, low magnesium. It's like a recipe for causing high blood pressure, diabetes, coronary artery disease, and premature death. High fructose corn syrup, often run through a chloralkali vat, contaminated by mercury. That's neurotoxic. The corn is non-organic corn sprayed with atrazine. It's not only feminizing, that will convert the male frog into a female frog. If you guys are curious, you might want to look up Tyrone Hayes. Tyrone Hayes was a PhD scientist at Harvard, and he figured this out, that atrazine was causing the male frogs to turn into female frogs. Very powerful estrogenic, and they told him to stop it. They told him to stop doing that. They're going to take away his research funding and discredit him. He said, no, I made a pledge that I would do the honorable thing, and he stuck with his research, and they did what they could to take away his funding, to discredit him, but he stuck with his research. It's a big story. Not only is atrazine causing feminization, it is also a mitochondrial inhibitor. So it lowers a person's energy. It's a terrible chemical. It's illegal in a lot of countries. Okay, on the non-organic soy, they spray glyphosate, which is also toxic to the myocardium. It's toxic to the gut, causes increased risk of leaky gut, increased intestinal permeability, increased tendency towards fatty liver, diabetes. It's also neurotoxic. It's an excitotoxin. It increases the activity of the glutamate receptors in the brain. Over 90% of brain neurotransmitters are glutamate. When you talk about brain neurotransmitters, glutamate is actually the most important one by far. It's 90% of cerebral cortex brain neurotransmitters. And then the ones everybody's heard of, they're actually all pretty rare. They're, GABA is about 5% of brain neurotransmitters, and then 1% for dopamine, for serotonin, acetylcholine, and all that other stuff. Glutamate's the big one, and this one increases activity in that receptor, which is not a good thing. Tap water is full of toxic chemicals. At the very least, you want to have a carbon water filter in your kitchen, because there's a lot of estrogenic chemicals, feminizing chemicals, and estrogen is a fat storage hormone, so it makes a person gain weight. It increases the risk of breast cancer. It increases the risk of fibroid tumors of the uterus, of uterine cancer. Ideally, it's nice to also have a reverse osmosis in the kitchen, like with the kitchen sink, but at the very least, you definitely want to have a carbon filter. That also removes chlorine. In the tap water, they typically put fluoride, which they tell you is good for your teeth. It has a very minimal effect on teeth. It's definitely a brain toxin, lowers IQ. And they also put aluminum in there, which they say, oh, well, it's a clarifier. Well, things will bind to it and the water will look more clear, but it's also a brain neurotoxin. And fluoride will bind tightly to it, form a complex with it, and increase its crossing into the brain across the blood-brain barrier. So it's sort of a magnified neurotoxic effect. And I'm sure it's just a coincidence that almost all this subsidized stuff is toxic to the brain, feminizing. Okay. So yeah, you can't win with processed food. You want to get away from it as fast as you can. The fried food too, we'll talk about it more later, but there was a Japanese neuroscientist named Tetsumori Yamashima, and he was given the task of why are so many Japanese becoming demented more and more? And he came to the conclusion it's from the fried food. Fried food undergoes a bunch of chemical reactions called lipid peroxidation. They produce something called toxic aldehydes, and those are damaging to the brain, damaging to the pancreas. They cause obesity, increased risk of diabetes, increased risk of dementia, cognitive decline. Okay, so we talked about the Nauru. Okay, here's a big study. This is one you really want to see. If you're on your computer, if you want, you can hit the print screen button and save this study. You're going to remember this the rest of your life. Okay, this is a research paper written in the Lancet Journal in 1929. The author's name was Donison. It's called Blood Pressure in the African Native. And this was all done with men from Kenya, black men from Kenya. And they checked the blood pressure of the patients admitted to the hospital, 1,800 patients. And not a single patient had hypertension, zero. If this was in the United States, probably about 80% of these patients would have hypertension. Okay, hypertension is off the charts in the USA. They also checked the blood pressures of men who were in the age groups approximately 60 years of age. White guys from Europe who had an average blood pressure of 140 over 90. Okay, mildly hypertensive. And then a black men from Kenya, same age, average age is 60. They had an average blood pressure of 105 over 67. Okay, there was nobody hypertensive, zero, none, nada. Okay, and the reason that's such a big deal is, what do medical students learn in the United States? And they still teach them the same thing now that they taught 40 years ago back when I was in med school. They tell them that, nobody knows what causes hypertension. 95% of it is of unknown cause, essential hypertension. It's idiopathic. You know what idiopathic means? It means the doctor's an idiot and the patient's pathetic, okay? It's ridiculous. The medical textbooks are ridiculous. They're a joke. I want you to know that, because a lot of people think, oh, modern science, it's so great. No, The internal medicine textbooks, in my opinion, are a joke. And they say about the same thing about all the common chronic diseases. It's associated with aging, seems to be part genetic, maybe sometimes it's due to a virus, maybe socioeconomic disparity. Nonsense. People who eat low-fat vegan diet, I don't care, wherever they are in the world, they don't get hypertension, all right? So that's important to know. All this genetic stuff, salt sensitivity because of the hot climate in Africa, that's all BS, okay? Zero hypertension if they eat a low-fat plant-based diet, okay? Trust me, that's big information. No, millions and millions and millions of people die because they don't know that. Okay, now the next thing is
low fat, Dr. Rogers. What's low fat to you? Below what percent?
I would say you'd want to keep it below 10%, I would say. You try to want to keep it below 10%. Some people say 15%. I would say aim for 10%. If you aim for 10%, you might, miss a little bit and end up at 15. But if you aim for 15, you probably end up at 20 and then you might not do so well. Okay, the thing I want to show here is what is called a K factor. K factor is the ratio of potassium to sodium. There's a guy by the name of Richard Moore. He wrote an excellent book called High Blood Pressure Solution. And what he talks about is the most important thing is not the amount of dietary sodium. It is true that if a person eats increased amounts of sodium, they have increased risk of becoming hypertensive. But what he showed is that it's really the ratio of potassium to sodium that determines the likelihood if they're going to become hypertension. And this is an important thing to know because once you understand this, you'll be okay with the fact. You'll hear a lot of contradictory information on the internet. You'll hear one person saying, you got to reduce your salt intake. Then you hear another person saying, it's not a big deal. Some salt is good for you. And what I'm trying to say here is, as long as you keep the ratio about in the ballpark of 10 times more potassium than sodium. If you're in kidney failure, then you got to be careful. Your kidneys might not be able to handle the potassium, but normal kidneys, even reasonably normal kidneys, can handle it. Our ancestors probably ate about 20% of 20 times more potassium than sodium. And here's the reason why. If you look inside of a cell, it's very high in potassium, the inner contents of a cell. But when you process food, they grind the food and they rinse it with solvents and they rinse away all the potassium. That's why processed food is very low in potassium. And then they put a lot of salt on it because salt tastes good, the sodium chloride, and it's a preservative. So processed food is the opposite of what you want. It's high in sodium, low in potassium. Just to give you, perspective numbers, everything highlighted yellow here is K factors for fruits. Typical fruits are anywhere from 100 to 500 K factor. They got tons of potassium. So fruits are good for preventing hypertension. Okay. The next thing here are starches. Starches are things like rice, beans, potatoes, sweet potatoes. They've got a K factors typically in the range of about 20 to 60. That's also, fantastic. Okay, populations who eat this way, they never get hypertension. All right, then the next thing is veggies. Veggies are okay. They're sort of in the ballpark of 5 to 15. So they're decent on K factor, but not quite like fruits or starches. And then now let's start looking at some of these processed foods, like a soy burger, K factor 1.6, not good. Cheerio cereal 1.2, not so good. And that's actually one of the better cereals, and it's bad. I quit eating cereals because every single one I looked at was high in sodium and tended to have MSG in there. They'll say extract, which is like a code word for MSG, MFG, excess glutamate added, which makes it taste good, but it's not good for your brain, etc. Okay, some of these other things like Special K cereal, which pretends to be a super health cereal because they add like a lot of vitamins and stuff to it. But look at its K factor, 0.06. That's terrible. It's like, give me hypertension food. So anyways, you can also tell if a food is highly processed. Just look at the K factor, estimate the K factor. And, if it's less than 4, it's a pretty highly processed food. I won't eat anything with more than one ingredient because they can also add stuff to the second ingredient. They don't have to tell you. But anyways, that K factor, trust me, that's a useful concept. And if you eat a low-fat vegan diet, you'll automatically have a good K factor. All right, just an example, epidemiology. Here's Tarahumara. They live in northern Mexico, near the Sierra Madre Copper Canyon area. They used to be combined with the Pima population. Mexican-American War in 1848, they got pulled apart. The Pima went into Arizona. They ate the standard American diet. The Tarahumara stayed in northern Mexico, kept their traditional ways. They eat a lot of corn. By the way, the people in Kenya eat tons of corn. And if you look at Kenya, they keep winning all these world championships in marathons and other long distance running. They had a guy named Kipchoge who won the marathon, set the world record at less than 2 hours. And he would just he ate tons of corn, okay? The Tarahumara ate the same thing. The only thing is they're eating organic corn. They're not eating the stuff sprayed with atrazine. So that's the advantage of organic. For some of those foods that are sprayed with atrazine, or for if they're sprayed with glyphosate, then I would make sure that those are organic if you're going to eat those foods. They also eat beans, squash. Rarely they'll eat a little meat. They'll eat local greens. Nathan Pritikin, who was this great nutrition genius of the 1970s and 80s, he patterned his diet after the Tarahumara. He was so impressed by them. And a lot of people have gone out and visited him. You know, USA, long distance runners, you know, and they're for real. They've been trained with them. There's been research papers written on them since going back to the 1960s. A guy named W.R. Connor wrote several good research papers on them. So they have no obesity. Nobody's fat. Nobody's hypertensive. Nobody's got coronary artery disease. These diseases pretty much don't exist in populations that eat low-fat, plant-based diets, okay? Yeah, because you have to, just so you know, all of this stuff about paleo, keto, carnivore, low carb, it's just a bunch of nonsense. The corporations have to keep you fat and sick if they're going to make money off you, you know? In order to sell you drugs, they got to make you fat and sick. So they try to, what they do is they typically get a good looking person, about 40 years of age, you know, real charming. And you're like, well, gee, I want to look like that. I'll just do what they're doing. But, you know, they're doing a commercial is what they're doing. They don't have any scientific data or epidemiology to support it. They're going to tell you epidemiology is of no value. Yeah, right. That's because it proves they're wrong, you know. You know, look at white rice, 1% of calories from fat, 1 billion out of 1 billion rice eaters. They're all skinny. Okay. Oh, by the way, I just meant to show you that the Pima are a disaster for health. They have terrible obesity, tons of gallbladder disease, getting their gallbladders taken out, diabetes, getting their legs amputated, open heart surgery for coronary artery disease. They're a health disaster, the Pima. You can look them up on your internet. Just type in Pima obesity, and you see all these fat Pima. Type in Tarahumara runner. You'll see all these skinny Tarahumara runners. Okay, another population, same story, Yanomamo. They're in the Amazon jungle of the border of Venezuela and Brazil. And they eat a plant-based diet. Their life is kind of stressful. They're always having these little battles between the local tribes, you know, trying to steal the women from the other tribe and other craziness. And so what the point I'm making is, despite their high stress level, they don't have any hypertension. And they don't add any salt to their food. They tested their urine. They almost couldn't find any salt in it. The kidney is made to conserve salt, to not let the sodium go into the urine. It's made to excrete the potassium, where our kidneys are designed to do that. Again, they eat lots of corn, local fruits, plantains, kind of like bananas, sweet potato-like food. You know, they eat a tiny bit of meat. There's no population in the wild that's 100% vegan. They'll usually be eating on the order of 5%, at the most 10% calories from meat. But I think for most Americans, you know, you've eaten probably a lousy diet when you were younger, some version of the standard American diet or the Mediterranean diet or something. And it's good to be 100% vegan. I'm 100% vegan for about 7 years. I was a lacto vegetarian for about 20 before that. And I had gotten fat in my 30s, and I'm like, oh my God, I got to figure this out. I don't want to end up fat and sick. These guys, they measure them when they're elderly. They have a blood pressure like 100/60. Okay. They never get high blood pressure. Okay. That's what happens. And they're real physically robust and active, you know. Two major patterns of atherosclerosis. This is called the Asian pattern, a lot of intracranial atherosclerosis. This is called the Western pattern, a lot of coronary artery disease. I'll tell you what I think this is about. Japan, 1960s and 70s, they smoked tons of cigarettes. They smoked like chimneys. And they also were putting tons of salt on their food, 12 to 14 grams a day. That's a ton. Average American's probably eating about 5 grams a day, which is too much. The Yanomamo were probably eating about 200 milligrams a day or less. But anyways, the reason I tell you this is because from the cigarette smoking and the high sodium, they get isolated hypertension, and it would cause a lot of intracranial atherosclerosis and strokes. The Americans eat the high-fat diet, and they get a lot of heart attacks from coronary artery disease. Okay, and here's what my guess is. The full force of hypertension is directed into the arteries of the brain, whereas the coronary arteries, to a large extent, they do a lot of their filling during diastole, during cardiac relaxation, related to the elastic recoil of the ascending thoracic aorta. So they're perfused with a little bit less pressure than is the brain. So that's my guess. I'm not 100% certain that explains it all, but that's my guess for why the Asians don't get much coronary artery disease. And William C. Roberts, he has a YouTube channel, the same name, William C. Roberts. He's probably the greatest cardiac pathologist who ever lived. He did thousands of autopsies on patients who died from coronary artery disease, cardiac arrhythmias, and other forms of cardiac disease. And he came to the conclusion without elevated blood cholesterol, the patients virtually never get coronary artery disease. So I haven't fully figured that one out. That was my theory about diastolic flow, but be that as it may, don't ever smoke cigarettes, stupid. Smoking marijuana is stupid. Vaping, all that stuff is stupid. You burn holes in your lung, you trash your arteries, raises your hematocrit, causes hypertension. It's all bad. It's all a disaster. Okay, none of it's good. Anything you heard good about it is just a commercial. Okay, I have a lot of friends who are neurologists. We talk to each other quite often. Tons of patients end up with brain damage from marijuana. Forget all that stuff. It's a bad idea. Okay, and so basically, here's how the diets play out. The American high-fat diet, they get high rates of pretty much everything. It's a terrible diet. Heart attack, good amount of stroke, cancer, diabetes, high blood pressure. We talked about the Japanese, Korean, Chinese. They're eating tons of white rice back in the day, like up to 90% of their calories from white rice. What mainly got them in trouble is they're smoking a lot of cigarettes and eating tons of sodium. That was the main thing that got them in trouble. They compensated by eating a lot of fruits and vegetables, and it was low in fat. So that's why they were relatively long-lived and healthy despite the cigarettes and the high sodium intake. The South Asian, meaning the people from India, they're surprisingly unhealthy. You look at a typical person from India, and they're usually kind of skinny, and you think they're pretty healthy, but they're actually, a lot of them are not very healthy. They got very high rates of diabetes, coronary artery disease, and I'll tell you what I think it is. I spent a while trying to figure this out. I talked to a bunch of them, and they eat a lot of fried food. And I think the fried food is taking them down that path, like I told you about the Tetsumori Yamashima. The omega-6 cooking oils from the fried foods, they undergo what are called lipid peroxidation reactions. Those produce toxic aldehydes like hydroxynonenal, and hydroxynonenal destroys brain cells, destroys pancreas cells, lowers IQ, causes diabetes. So sort of a type 1.5 diabetes, I guess you could call it, but it's a disaster for health. Because I've seen these Indian guys. I had this Indian doctor friend, and I hadn't seen him, in about 3.5 months. I'm like, hey, how you doing? Where you been? He said, I was dead. I go, what do you mean you were dead? And he goes, I was dead. I had a heart attack. I had to be resuscitated, brought back to life. And I go, how'd you have a heart attack? You're skinny. You're a vegetarian. You're always walking around all the time. And he says, I don't know. And I said, are you a vegetarian? He goes, yeah. I said, it's the oil. And he goes, well, how am I going to cook without oil? I'm like, you don't need oil. All the starches, you could just boil them. So anyways, here it is, low-fat vegan. Hardly any diabetes. Hardly any. Next to zero, diabetes, hypertension, heart attack, stroke, okay, impotence, cancer. I mean, very low amounts, all that stuff. It's the best you can do. That's why I eat that way, because I want to be healthy. I don't care about animal rights. I mean, I wish the animals well, but I don't care. I think a lot of those animal rights people are crazy, okay? I just want to be healthy, all right? I'm not a religious, philosophical vegetarian. Some of these religions, like Seventh-day Adventists, it's like part of their religion is to be a vegetarian. That's nice, but for me, I want to be healthy, okay? If you'd asked me vegetarian diet when I was younger, I think they're like a bunch of sandal-wearing, pot-smoking hippies. I wouldn't have been interested in it at all, okay? I'm interested in it because I've studied this extensively, and that's what keeps arteries open. The next thing, we're talking about what causes brain damage, dementia. I'm going to tell you something that will surprise you. If you open up any book or talk to a typical conventional trained doctor, they're going to tell you, Alzheimer's is the most common cause of dementia. Yeah, right. It's a bunch of nonsense, okay? There is such a thing as a genetics familial form of Alzheimer's. That's a real thing. But most of what are the so-called sporadic, random Alzheimer's is really nonsense. And let me explain why I say that. What's the historical question you can ask the patient to diagnose it? There is none. What's the physical exam? Can you put the stethoscope on them and diagnose it? No physical exam finding. What's the reliable blood test? There's no reliable blood test to diagnose it. How about brain MRI? I'm a neuroradiologist, by the way. I've seen like 100,000 brain MRIs. I've lost count a long time ago, decade ago. All right, so anyways, what I'm trying to tell you is I almost never see the so-called pattern of parietal temporal atrophy, okay? That's nonsense. And then what about autopsy, the gold standard? No. They find a lot of the patients have all the senile plaques, extracellular, neurofibrillary tangles, intracellular, that don't have dementia. And then the ones that are demented maybe don't have it. So that's why they came up with that Mankato, Minnesota, Notre Dame nun study where the nuns donated their brains to science. And the nuns that were more literate, that liked to write letters and teach, they would have a lot of these lesions in their brain, but they wouldn't be demented. And so they did this retrofit add-on to the theory saying, well, they've got cognitive reserve. So if a person has more cognitive reserve, they can have a higher burden of lesions and still not have Alzheimer's. What they're trying to do is hang on to the theory that doesn't fit the data, okay? And they wanted to try to make everybody think Alzheimer's was so common, because if you're a research corporation and you could convince the people who give out the funding money that Alzheimer's is by far the most common, they'll give you more money for research. It's a way to scam millions of dollars. Okay, so here's one book about it, How Not to Study Disease, about what a bunch of nonsense Alzheimer's research is. There's several books been written on that. You would be surprised if you start looking up that topic, what a scam that is. Okay, so I'm going to show you what really happens with dementia. We're going to get to that in just a little bit. And by the way, plant foods is pretty much like just about everything that's good tends to be in low-fat plant foods. Almost everything that's bad is in processed food and meats. Okay. And by the way, I like the farmers. Okay, like I told you, I like farmers, and even the cattle farmers. I like them a lot more than I like the animal rights people. I was considering being a wildlife biologist, and when I was at Stanford, so I knew some of the highest people, world famous people in the environmental movement, and I was really disillusioned with them because they mostly don't like people. They don't like people more than they like animals. Okay, they wanted to take all this land away from the farmers, shut down the farmers. I'm like, hey, we need food. Leave the farmers alone. Okay, anyways, what's in the plants? You got the fiber. You need fiber. That also protects your brain. It not only protects the gut barrier, it also protects the blood-brain barrier. Potassium and magnesium are vasodilators. They keep your arteries open. Nitrates are the precursors to make nitric oxide. They keep your arteries open. By the way, that's what health is all about. It's about keeping your arteries open. If you block an artery with a clot in your brain, that's a stroke. You block an artery in the heart with a clot, that's a heart attack. You don't want that. And the same thing happens all over the body. Another thing a lot of people don't know, atherosclerosis is a blood clot. I'll explain that in more detail, but it's very valuable to understand that. By the way, I did a fellowship at Harvard in interventional radiology, imaging-guided surgery with an emphasis on vascular disease. I've been, interested in atherosclerosis for a long, long time, like 30 years, and I've been studying it, writing book chapters on it, and that's an important thing to know. We'll come back to it, but remember, it's a blood clot. So anything that causes blood to clot is going to increase your risk of atherosclerosis, okay, and the diseases related to it. Antioxidants like vitamin C's in the plant foods, they're relatively alkaline, which is good, lowers the risk of cancer, makes life easier for your kidneys. They're low in protein. Other than the beans, they tend to be low in protein, which is actually beneficial. They're full of complex carbohydrates, which is basically means glucose combined with fiber, which is a good thing. They're low in phytates because they're poorly absorbed. They're relatively low in iron, which ends up being a good thing. I don't like the high-fat plant foods. I recommend you avoid those. High fat coming from anything increases the risk of atherosclerosis. Okay, whereas the meat, it's got different type of animal protein. It's got different type of amino acids. It's got more leucine and methionine amino acids, and those both cause more activation of mTOR, a nutrient sensing pathway, sort of like a building contractor. It needs to get all its building materials together before it will build, which means before the cell will replicate. And you don't want to activate mTOR because you accelerate the rate at which cells replicate. Means you only get about 60 cell divisions. That's called the Hayflick limit before a non-stem cell goes into senescence, basically dies, because DNA polymerase can't get to the edge of the chromosome, and it'll shorten a little bit with each replication. And eventually you shorten into genes that the cell needs. So you don't want to accelerate cell replication. If you're 20 years old, you want to be a muscle man bodybuilder, you might want to speed up cell growth and replication. But you get to your 30s, you're not a world-class bodybuilder. You don't want that because you're accelerating your aging. Because the cells, they run out. It's like you tip over the egg timer, the hourglass. You run out of sand when you hit that 60 cell divisions. So you don't want to speed it up. They got a whole bunch of other things. We're not going to go through all this list. It's just basically you'll spend a long time counting all the problems with meat and processed food. There's nothing to be desired about. And processed food is worse than, like grass-fed beef or something, but still, you don't need it at all. Okay, here's another thing the companies to make processed food, they've got billions of dollars, these companies. They're incredibly rich, and they bring people in to test them, to test the food on them. And they're looking for what's called the bliss point. They, manipulate the amount of salt in there. They manipulate the amount of sweetener, high fructose corn syrup, aspartame, those sorts of things. Monosodium glutamate, manufactured glutamate. It's really the glutamate that matters, manufactured free glutamate. And they just titrate it until the people like it the most. They call it the bliss point to make them addicted to it. So people can't stop eating the junk food. It tastes good. And it's sort of like you get a short-term benefit, but you get a long-term problem from it, okay? Said it's like a HIV positive hooker, okay? It might look appealing for 5 seconds, but it's a bad idea. Okay, now here is a neuron. Here is the cell body, the beginning of the neuron, the dendrite, the sensing component, and then it sends a message to the neuron distal to it. It'll release its neurotransmitter that'll go across the synaptic cleft. It'll bind to the postsynaptic neuron and exert an effect upon it. Okay, here is a little more detail. An action potential is fired, which means an electrical message is sent down the length of the neuron, and it travels down the length of the neuron. Once it gets to the neuron axon terminal, it'll activate what are called voltage-gated calcium channels, and that will then cause the neurotransmitter to be released. It'll merge with the plasma membrane, and then it'll diffuse into the synaptic cleft, the neurotransmitter, exert an effect on the postsynaptic neuron. By the way, it's also best to not hold your cell phone up to your head. It's better to use speakerphone when possible. I realize there's going to be some situations where you have to keep it next to your head, but in general, it's better to use speakerphone because it's a low power microwave transmitter that'll open up voltage gated calcium channels. That's just one more thing opening up these calcium channels in your brain. You don't want that. They sort of cause increased activity of it. And it can make a person a little bit anxious, hyperactive, impulsive, can cause insomnia. And I think this is harmful to a lot of teenagers. They're constantly on their phones. And it causes increased activation of your brain cells. You don't want that. Then they're eating all this processed food with caffeine and with the extra glutamate in it, MSG, MSG, and it can cause anxiety. The glyphosate's an excitotoxin activating the same receptor. Well, it's actually the NMDA channel that lets in calcium, but they're sort of flooding their neurons with this unnatural sources of calcium, which make them hyperreactive. And again, young people have a lot of anxiety. They have a lot of behavior problems, impulse control, and these are things related to it. So you don't want to, add to it with these other problems. All right, now here's what manufactured-free glutamate is. Manufactured-free glutamate, MFG, is actually more common than monosodium glutamate nowadays. So what it means is you take a protein and you start to process it. You can ultra-pasteurize it. The most common word you'll see on food labels is extract. And what they're doing is, a protein is like a necklace with a bunch of beads, okay? And the letter G is for glutamate. Remember, that's the excitatory neurotransmitter of the brain. And when they process it, they break apart the individual beads on the necklace until they're freed up, all the glutamates. And now they put all these glutamate into the processed food, and that can make food taste really good because our ancestors worried about starving to death. So when they found a good protein source for them, that was good, and it would release reward neurotransmitters in their brain. But they take advantage of your natural inclination, these food companies, and they stuff it full of glutamate. So when you eat that stuff, it's like almost catching a buzz, if you will, in a sense, and it makes the food taste real good. And even if the food is stale, terrible food, it can make it taste pretty good, this glutamate stuff. And again, this can cause insomnia. It can cause migraine headaches. It causes increased activity in the brain cells, which over time can contribute to dementia. This lady here, Catherine Reed, PhD, she was a biochemist, a protein biochemist, and her daughter had autism. And it was a relatively mild autism, but she was autistic. She was all in special ed and all these other problems. And the mother learned that MSG can cause autism in some people. Autism is multifactorial. There's other things that cause it too, but MSG can cause it. She took her kid off it, and her kid got better. She wrote a book called Fat, Stressed, and Sick. She's got videos about that as well. There's a good TED Talk. So Catherine Reed on MSG and autism is a good TED Talk. All right, now here is a look at the brain. This is a coronal section from front to back. The hippocampus is the memory center of the brain. The standard joke is, what neuroscience center has the fattest students? The hippocampus. Okay, just a joke. But that's the memory center of the brain. All right, I'll see if I got more anatomical pictures, but in case I don't, this is the basal ganglia level, where these are called the deep nuclei of the brain, the gray matter down deep in the brain. These are the cerebral ventricles. At the level of the ventricles is going to be corona radiata. Above that is centrum semiovale. So I look at these things all the time. Those are the words we use all the time to describe these films. Oh, one guy is good to know about is Jack Delatorre. Jack Delatorre has what's called the vascular hypothesis of dementia. And he did great work. This is his book. He's a PhD scientist out of Texas. Okay, I'm going to show you what he did. He tied off the carotid artery in a mouse. And then middle-aged and older mice, 2 months later, would become demented. And then he did an autopsy, opened up the skull, looked at the mouse brain. He's expecting to see a big stroke on the side where he tied off the carotid artery, but there was no stroke. Well, that's interesting. He repeated the experiment, tying off the other side, tying them both off, tying off the arteries in the back, vertebral arteries, tying off intracranial arteries like the middle cerebral artery, MCA. And whatever he tied off, it would diminish the blood supply to that part of the brain. And over the course of a couple months, the brain would shrink and the animal would become demented. Okay, so there's two major types of cell death in brain cells. One is sudden death, okay? Sudden death is a stroke, for example. You completely block the blood supply, so there's no blood flow. That neuron will just die. And when the neuron dies, it happens so rapidly that it just bursts. It bursts open. All of its contents are spread all over the place. It's a big mess. I can look at a brain MRI and point to the stroke. There's a stroke right here in the prefrontal gyrus of the left frontal lobe. You know exactly where it is, okay? Apoptosis is slow cell death. It sort of means like a falling off of a leaf, like in Greek. So apoptosis means the cell gradually dies real slow and it recycles itself. It puts its inner chemical contents into vesicles, and then the microglia, the macrophages, the guard cells of the brain, they'll eat it and recycle it and send it to other parts of the body. So what's happening here is a partial drop in blood supply, because even when you tie off the big carotid on one side, there's collateral branches. You can think of them like side streets. Big arteries, you can think of them like a highway. And then the small arteries are little side streets. They'll still provide some blood flow to this side of the brain, but not enough. And those brain cells will just keep losing more and more of them, and the brain will shrink. So when you first hear that, you say to yourself, oh, well, too bad. Not that many people have a fully occluded carotid artery. That's true. But lots of people have cerebral hypotension. Let me explain. A lot of people, they overtreat their hypertension. They take too much medicines and they drop their pressure too low. You're like the mouse on both sides, okay? Other people, they have uncontrolled, really high hypertension, and the high pressures damage the arteries of their brain, and that causes atherosclerosis, which gradually increases, and that'll drop the oxygen delivery to the brain. Not good. Okay, diabetes will damage the arteries of the brain. A lot of people, you know, they're real fat, and they got and some of them aren't even fat. They got obstructive sleep apnea, congestive heart failure. You're not pumping enough blood to the brain. You're like the mouse. That's why I call it the mouse equivalent theory. Atrial fibrillation. You don't have good atrial filling of the ventricles. You're tacking away too fast. You don't get enough blood to the brain. You're like the mouse. Vascular cause of hypertension. If you got, you know, severe aortic valve stenosis, aortic regurgitation, you're like the mouse. Post-coronary artery bypass graft, they sometimes run them a little hypotensive in the operating room. Sometimes post-op, they'll run the patient kind of hypotensive in the ICU. My dad had an open heart surgery of that type. And I said to the anesthesiologist, why are you running his pressure so low? His pressure was like 90/60. And he's like, well, we don't want him to bleed his anastomosis. I'm like, you know what? I don't want him to stroke, okay? And don't get me wrong, my dad came out of it fine, but my dad, I think, was a lot healthier than the average cabbage patient. Okay, I didn't know enough back in those days. That was about 28 years ago to talk him out of it. But I think a lot of patients would have a hard time tolerating that and can sometimes get post-cabbage hypotension and cognitive decline. Okay, here's the slide that I thought I had in here, and I'm glad I do. These are the basal ganglia, deep nuclei, basal ganglia. Here's the corona radiata. These are called the lateral ventricles. This is called the third ventricle. That's basal ganglia level. Lateral ventricles is corona radiata level. Centrum semiovale is the deep white matter, the myelinated fibers in the center of the brain, above the lateral level of the lateral ventricles. And I put a skull and crossbones in here to show you the most common site of stroke. Okay, first of all, from hypertension, these little arteries that go into the basal ganglia are called the lenticulostriates, and hypertension can damage these arteries. You can get an infarct in these arteries. You'll often call it a lacunar infarct. That means a hole. You'll see a little hole in the brain due to hypertensive infarcts in this area. Sometimes you get a little bleeding in there. Just a little bleeding is common. That would be called a hemorrhagic lacunar infarction. You know, not a big deal. It's a stroke. I mean, it's a stroke. That's bad, but I see those, you know, every day. All right. I see a couple of those every day, but this is what I see most commonly. I see hundreds, thousands of these every day. So what happens is the blood has to come up. This is the middle cerebral artery, goes up along the convexities of the brain, and then you have the penetrating arteries. And this area here is called a watershed, meaning that it doesn't really have good collateral. There's no good alternative pathway. So if you start plugging up these arteries with atherosclerosis, or you drop your pressure too low, overtreated hypertension, you don't get very good blood supply to these areas, and people can get tons of little strokes. One patient can have over 100 of these little strokes, and these are things that will be associated with, cognitive slowing, physical slowing of a patient. Okay, so you don't want that, and that's why you want to try to be as healthy as possible. In my experience, most people simply don't get it. They think I'm doing okay. The typical person says, well, I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. And my response to that would be, okay, compared to what? Usually when a person says I'm doing okay, they sort of mean, well, at least I'm not as fat as my cousin. Okay, well, gee, that's nice. But the proper goal should be, what's the best I could do? And you want to do as best you can, because most people in America, they don't age well. You don't want to be average. Average means you're not aging well. You want to do better than average. Okay, you want to keep your arteries open as much as possible. You want to control all your medical conditions as best you can with diet and lifestyle. Sometimes you're going to need medication. Sometimes you're going to need surgery and all these other procedures. But to the extent you can, it's nice to prevent all that. I am 61 going on 62. I don't take any medicines. I don't have any medical problems. All right, that's the way I'm going to try to keep it. I've never had to have surgery. I'm going to try to keep it that way, hopefully. Okay, these are some books I wrote. We don't need to get into all that. All right, this is normal capillary in the brain. The yellow part here is the capillary basement membrane. The green stuff are the vascular smooth muscle cells, or pericytes, we'll call them, in the brain. These red cells are the red blood cells traveling through this capillary. And the blue circles are the oxygen being delivered to the brain cell, the neuron. Okay, so this is all how it should be. The red blood cell's diameter is about 7 microns. You want to know that number. 7 microns is the red cell. Typical capillary is about 5 microns. And the point I'm going to make is that even a normal red blood cell, to get through that capillary, has to fold back on itself a little bit to fit through there. All right. So now here is a capillary that has disease. It's got, hypertension and diabetes. The diabetes is causing thickening of the capillary basement membrane. The yellow part here is thick compared to up here. Hypertrophy, hyperplasia of the vascular smooth muscle cells. A lot of times there'll be some collagen fibrosis laid down in the arterial wall. And so there's fewer blue circles going from the red cells up to the neuron, the brain cell. So this is how a person over time, chronic diabetes, hypertension, keeps having worsening atherosclerosis, and they're progressively getting less and less ability to deliver oxygen and glucose to the brain. So that's not good, okay? And then if you superimpose on top of that high-fat meals, more sodium, all these excitotoxins, then you're setting up a recipe for losing brain cells. Okay, here's a normal-looking brain, a CAT scan. And the brain's up pretty tight. You can see it's sort of just about touching the brain. The white circle around it is the skull, the bone. Okay, and there's not a lot of cerebral spinal fluid. This dark stuff here is cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, so this is what I call a tight brain. It's up relatively tight up against the bone. Okay, this is a normal looking 50-year-old. Okay, it's a good looking 50-year-old brain. Now here's a brain, let's say in an 80-year-old who's demented. You'll notice that there's a big expansion of the cerebral spinal fluid along the convexities of the brain. Okay, so a lot of CSF, and that's because the brain is shrunken. This is like a shrunken brain. It has atrophied and decreased in size, and that's what you get with chronically losing brain cells due to the things we were talking about, like Delatorre's mouse equivalents, okay? Now, here is a normal-looking brain MRI, and this is something called a flare sequence, which is really like a T2 fluid suppressed sequence. What that means is fluid will be bright on here, except the cerebral spinal fluid signal is suppressed. And so on a brain MRI, the white stuff is abnormal. So this is a normal brain. You got nice small ventricles, relatively tight brain up against the skull. The skull is blackened when you use this technique on MRI, flare sequence. This right here is, and by the way, flare is the best brain sequence. If you were stranded on a desert island and you had to do brain MRI and you only could have one sequence, you would want to do flare. Okay, so here's a typical brain, let's say for an 85-year-old. Now, don't get me wrong. I sometimes see 85-year-old who got clean brain parenchyma just like this, and that's what you want to aspire to. But I often see them looking like this. Each one of these things is a little stroke, and this is what I meant by you could have 100 little strokes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. How do you even count them? Because they start to coalesce together. So this one, it's like, remember the old show, Petty Junction? Uncle Joe's running kind of slow at the junction. The more of these you have, the slower you're going to function, okay? The slower your brain is going to be able to respond to anything, the slower you're going to be able to move. So you're going to start losing your energy, your vitality, your nuance. You don't want this, okay? And these silent strokes just add up, and they don't necessarily cause like paralysis of your arm or your leg, at least not initially. So you might not notice it. You just see the person sort of progressively deteriorating, weaker, stupider, less able to do anything. And this happens to a lot of people. And that's why you want to get your act together as good as you can to keep your brain functioning at, a high level for as long as you can, because there's one thing is your lifespan is how old are you when you die. But another thing is your health span. How healthy are you, as you go along? All right. Now, these are little microhemorrhages. This is a special brain MRI sequence called SWI, susceptibility weighted imaging. And you sometimes call these multiple black dots. Okay. This is the multiple black dots differential diagnosis. When they're central, that's characteristically thought of as hypertension related, old hypertension related hemorrhagic lacunar infarctions. Okay. The ones in the periphery, a lot of times are attributed to old trauma. But they also will say, well, it could be cerebral amyloid angiopathy, which is this dementia disease. I'll tell you what I think. I think they're mostly hypertension. And I say that because it's the same patients who have hypertensive retinopathy in their eyes. They're the same ones that tend to get these peripheral old microbleeds, all right? But these are pretty common. I'll see these every day. I'll see some of these. The most common thing I see by far, by a factor of 1,000, is I see this all day long, every day, nonstop. It's so common, it's part of my automatic macro dictation when I look at a brain MRI. That is ubiquitous. This I see a couple times every day. Okay, now here's something that everybody knows about. Oh my God, her blood pressure is too high. She might have a big intracranial bleed. Oh my God. And you know what that's like? That's like a shark attack, Everybody's scared of a shark out in the ocean. How many people you know that have been bit by a shark? Okay, it's rare. You probably never see a shark attack in your whole life. What I'm trying to say is I'm a neuroradiologist. I look at tens of thousands of brain MRIs. I see one of these, every 4 months, maybe every 6 months. It's rare. It's really rare. So yes, it's a terrible thing. A patient can die from this, but it's rare. You're most likely not too many people. You probably never meet anybody in your life that died from a basal ganglia hemorrhage. Okay. You can do things to improve neuronal function in the brain. If you exercise, you read, you eat a healthy diet, you'll get new blood vessels from the exercise. That's called angiogenesis. It releases something called brain-derived neurotropic growth factor that increases the formation of new brain cells, new neurons. That's called neurogenesis. You'll store more glycogen for energy in the brain cells and the astrocytes. You'll form new synapses, synaptogenesis. Like I said, new neurons, neurogenesis. So you can keep on improving the brain. You can keep on learning things as you get older. That's good for you. So reading, studying, having good intellectual conversations, watching educational videos, exercising, all of that is quite good for the brain. Okay, one thing to know about a stroke is there's such a concept as penumbra. So in the center of a stroke, you've got dead brain. That's called the core infarct, right up tight. And one way you could visualize it is, let me show you what a marker. So here's this orange marker. Let's say the center of the orange part is the stroke, the dead brain, right where the mouse was on there. And then right around it, my hand around it, that would be the penumbra. Penumbra in Greek means twilight. So those are the brain cells that are low on oxygen, but they're not dead yet. So that's why after somebody has a stroke or a traumatic brain injury, you want them to be as healthy as possible. Let them relax, take it easy. You don't want to give them overtreat their hypertension and drop the blood flow more, because they got to maintain blood flow to the penumbra or they can lose it. This is the kind of situation if a person has a stroke and then a couple days later, a week later, they get much worse. They probably stroked out their penumbra. So all those little tiny white spots, those little small strokes I showed you a couple slides ago, each one of those has a little penumbra. And that's why no matter where you are in the game, you always want to be as healthy as you can to minimize losing whatever penumbra you have, or wherever you have one of those little strokes, you have a little bit of a leaky blood-brain barrier around it. So you just want to have good health habits. What I say to myself is, human health is a little bit like one of those video games like Super Mario Brothers. You're walking through life. It's like an obstacle course, okay? If you do the good things, eat the low-fat, plant-based diet, get along with people, avoid unnecessary stress, you get energy points. You get good points that help your health. You do the bad stuff, get into unnecessary arguments, get stressed out over stupid stuff, eat junk food, stay up too late, all those things, you lose energy points. And so you can get away with, bad habits when you're 20 years old, but the older you get, 40, 50, 60, 70 on up, you can't get away with so much. You don't have as much physiological reserve to handle it. So the older you get, the more you got to improve your health habits. And I say to myself, I'm only going to do the things that are good for me, and I'm going to avoid all the things that are bad for me. Why would I want to do anything that's bad for me? To eat bad food is like poisoning yourself. Why would I want to poison myself? That's stupid. I'm not going to do that. And in order to know that, you have to know what's good for you and what's bad for you. So that's why it's worth learning and studying these things. Okay, here's an atherosclerosis plaque. And the good news is that they're partially reversible. Like I was saying, they're really a blood clot that forms, and then the immune system comes in and tries to reabsorb them. So it's like an organizing hematoma. It's been described by pathologists. And it can be partly reabsorbed. The dead cells can be reabsorbed. That's called the necrotic core. The lipid cells, like lipid-containing macrophages, foam cells, you can sometimes call them, those can be reabsorbed, shrink the plaque. The acellular fibrous tissue, collagen, you're not going to reabsorb that probably. The cellular component, you might partially reabsorb that. The acute blood clot, that part can be reabsorbed. Calcifications, I don't think you're going to remove those. Some people say they think you can, but I've never seen it, so I don't believe it up at this point. Another little trick a lot of people aren't aware of is that you form a clot in the wall of the artery, and then you have circulating endothelial precursor cells that come along and they cover it up. And so that's a mechanism by which the atherosclerotic plaque will become subintimal, subendothelial, okay? That's actually, if you end up being interested in the pathophysiology of atherosclerosis, that's good to know. If, for just keeping yourself healthy, you don't need to know that. Just be aware that you can shrink the plaque. Plus, when you start improving your diet and avoiding all the salt and all the fat, the endothelial cells will start to produce more nitric oxide vasodilator. So you can see an improvement in function pretty quickly, in a couple of days. And over more time, it'll gradually get reabsorbed. You'll see even more improvement with time. Okay. All right. Now, here's something called the Windkessel effect. This is good to know about. Your heart contracts. That's called systole. It's a Greek word for contraction. So it's the arrows going in. That's contraction of the left ventricle. And then they push blood up into the ascending thoracic aorta. Ascending thoracic aorta, when that blood comes in, it's stretched outward. So that's what these arrows mean. It's the ascending thoracic aorta is stretched outward. And then when the heart relaxes, the Greek word for that is diastole. Then the elastic fibers of the ascending thoracic aorta, they will have elastic recoil and come inward. And that elastic recoil pushes the blood up towards your brain and the rest of your body during diastole. That generates diastolic flow. So the ascending thoracic aorta has been called the second heart. That also helps to perfuse the coronary arteries. Okay, and it's been called the Windkessel effect, like that. It kind of looks like a little accordion. You hold your hands on it and you move it back and forth like this to blow air on the kindling in a fire to try to start a fire in the fireplace. Okay, the reason I'm showing you this is that if a person's been chronically hypertensive, let's say for a couple of decades, you cannot replace these fibers once you've come of maturity. You're over like 20 years of age or so. So people will lose the Windkessel effect because they'll have overstretched their elastic fibers in their ascending thoracic aorta. And what that means is they're no longer going to be able to generate this elastic recoil. And because they can't generate elastic recoil effectively, they're going to have to increase their systolic blood flow. The reason you have a blood pressure is to get blood to the top of your brain, to pump that blood against gravity, to get an adequate amount of oxygen and glucose to your brain. Your regular blood is kind of like water in terms of its thickness. That's also called viscosity. When you eat a high-fat diet, that makes the red blood cells stick together, and your blood becomes thicker. It becomes like a milkshake. So now you're pumping a milkshake up to your brain, so the pressure has to go up to pump the thick blood. And then if you eat a lot of salt, salt's a vasoconstrictor, so it takes the arteries from their baseline diameter and constricts them, makes them more narrow. So if you make the arteries narrow and you eat a high-fat meal, like you're eating a pizza or something, that's a double bad situation because now you're pumping thick blood through a constricted system. Pressure has to go up more, so you get more hypertension. So that's why I eat low-fat and low salt. I don't add salt to my food. Okay, the fat's a bigger problem than the salt. And I eat lots of fruits and vegetables, so I have my K factor is probably like around 20 or more. Okay, here's red blood cells. We talked about how they're a little bit bigger than the capillary. Red cells about 7 microns in diameter. Capillary is about 5 microns in diameter. And then you have bridging molecules. Bridging molecules are things that stick the red blood cells together. Okay, and then now you're pushing a submarine sandwich through the capillaries. Pressure has to go up. Normal blood flow is called laminar blood flow. It's like your hand. Okay, I can do it this way. The fingers in the middle are these 2 red arrows. Those are the red blood cells. They go with the fastest velocity. Right next to them are the white blood cells, the blue arrows, and then the black is for the plasma, stuff like the liquid of the blood. Now, normal blood flow is laminar flow. That's how you want your blood flow to be most of the time. It's sometimes called a parabolic velocity profile. Remembering it being like your hand, that's a valuable way. That makes it easy to remember. Okay, so red blood cells on their outer surface, they all have a negative charge. The negative charge is called the zeta potential. If you're on a computer later on, you can just type into the browser, red blood cell, RBC zeta potential, and you'll see all these pictures pop up. This has actually been known for a long time, especially by people that work in a blood bank where they got to store the blood. They got a negative charge all on their outer surface. All of the red blood cells have a zeta potential. All of the white blood cells have a zeta potential. All of the endothelial cells have a zeta potential. The plasma proteins, like the albumin, have a zeta potential, a negative charge. And that's to prevent everything from sticking together. Because if stuff sticks together, it forms a clot. That's bad. You know, if you watch the movies on TV, you see people, you know, they get shot or something and they bleed, and like it's all the drama. In real life, hardly anybody dies from that. Almost everybody dies from blood clots. A clot in the heart, that's a heart attack. A clot in the brain, in the artery, that's a stroke, okay? And even cancer, a lot of times, is caused by clotted off arteries, leading to lack of oxygen and glucose delivery, injures the mitochondria. The cell changes from being like a team player as part of an organ system, become like an anaerobic bacteria and just wants to replicate, running on glycolysis. That's why PET scans are positive and take up 100 times more glucose. Okay, we're not going to get into that, but the point I'm trying to say is what you want to prevent is clotting. Okay, and now there's something called a bridging molecule. A bridging molecule is a positively charged molecule big enough in size that it overcomes the zeta potential and grabs the RBCs and sticks them together. Okay, you don't want that. Typical bridging molecule we most often talk about is LDL cholesterol. And the more higher your LDL cholesterol, the more your red blood cells are going to stick together. Okay, IgM antibodies in acute infection can do that. Fibrinogen, the clotting protein, can do that. Uric acid can do that. Okay, those are some of the things that increase the likelihood that blood clots are going to form. So here's a graph. The higher the LDL cholesterol, the higher the blood viscosity. Okay, Gregory Sloop was one of the pioneering doctors that worked on a lot of this work, and he wrote the papers on what's called atherothrombosis theory, explaining the atherosclerosis of blood clot. He's a pathologist too. Okay, it's not just LDL cholesterol; it's other types of fat as well. So LDL cholesterol is a type of fat. Cholesterol is a fat. It's also triglycerides. It's also chylomicrons. They will do this. Okay. That's why it's good to minimize all forms of dietary fat. There's a guy by the name of David Blankenhorn, who wrote papers in the 1970s, 1980s, and they tried all kinds of different dietary fat. It didn't matter what type of fat the patient ate. Any fat would increase the patient's risk of forming atherosclerotic plaque. Okay, this is Peter Quo. He was a cardiologist in the 1950s in Pennsylvania. He took a bunch of cardiac angina patients and fed them high-fat diets, and he checked their blood lipids every 30 minutes. And what he found was at peak lipemia, you know, usually in the range of around 3.5 to 7 hours, the patients would have chest pain episodes. So nowadays, you would never get this past an internal review board, the IRB. They wouldn't let you do the study. And back in those days, there was no thrombolysis. There was no coronary artery balloon angioplasty and stenting. You know, these patients could have died. But anyways, you know, he didn't know any better. So at peak lipemia, when the blood lipids are highest, that's when they would get lots of episodes of chest pain. And then they said, well, maybe it's from the saturated fat, like Ansel Keys had shown sat fat increases coronary artery atherosclerosis in the 1950s, 1960s. So they said, we're going to try omega-6 cooking oils. They've got to be a lot safer than saturated fat from animal foods. And they found out that the omega-6 cooking oils were even worse. They caused more prolonged blood sludging. And in hyperlipidemia, patients were at risk for cardiac angina. They've also been able to watch these, looking with microscopes, 80-fold microscopes over the eyes, and you can see capillaries occluding. They usually would come back, but you don't want to run the risk of losing capillaries in your eyes. It could make you go blind. So what I'm trying to say is you're not going to win with fat. You feed the patient a carbohydrate meal, they don't have any of these problems. They don't get any angina, okay? They don't get insulin resistance from isolated carbohydrates. Endothelial cells, ECs for endothelial cells, the cells that line your arteries, they're spindle-shaped, orientated in the direction of flow. Okay, they produce nitric oxide. That's the most important thing they do. It's a gas, and the gas diffuses into the lumen of the artery. It interacts with the platelets to prevent them from clotting. The gas diffuses into the wall of the artery, goes to the smooth muscle cells, and causes them to relax. The smooth muscle cells are wrapped circumferentially around the artery. So when they relax, that allows the artery to open up wider. So they cause vasodilation. They open up the arteries. And that's what you want. You want your arteries open up so they provide good blood flow to your tissues and everything functions well. That's the key thing to making something function well, that it has good blood flow. Because people sometimes ask me, how can I get better? They've got a fracture or an infection or something. I'm like, well, you want to increase blood flow to the wound. How do you increase blood flow to the wound? You eat a low fat, low sodium vegan diet with no oil. Okay. You need good immune function. How do you get good immune function? Same thing, low fat, low sodium vegan diet with no oil. And you want to avoid unnecessary stress, get your sleep, avoid caffeine. It's a vasoconstrictor. Raises the same hormones of stress, catecholamines and cortisol. Catecholamines are epinephrine, norepinephrine. So all of that stuff is bad, okay? Sleep deprivation, psychological stress, and caffeine all do pretty much the same thing. They increase epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. All those things are bad. They'll cause more atherosclerosis, more hypertension, more diabetes, less immune system function. Okay, now here's what I was getting at with hypertension. So the blood pressure is coming up. It's going to hit the median divider. This is the common carotid artery in the neck. So think of that as being my forearm, okay? Think the internal carotid artery, the external carotid artery has all these branches, like my fingers, they go to the face. My thumb is the internal carotid artery. It goes up through the skull into the brain. So you can think of it this way. External carotid, my fingers, thumb is my internal carotid, and my forearm is the CCA, common carotid artery. Anyways, the blood pressure comes up and it hits the median divider, and then it bounces off of it. When it bounces off of it right here, that's going to be chaotic flow. Chaotic flow is also called turbulent flow. It's just random in all these directions. Some of it will form these retrograde currents that go backwards. Those are called eddy currents, and they're kind of slow. Well, what happens is they confuse the endothelial cell. The endothelial cell is expecting primarily laminar flow in the expected direction. When you get all this chaotic flow and retrograde eddy currents, there's little hair-like cilia sensors on top of the endothelial cells. And they're like, hey, what's going on? Seems like a vascular injury. They have a surface coating called a glycocalyx, about 600 nanometers high. They will start to shed that. And then deep below that, about 60 nanometers high, they've got these vascular adhesion molecules that will bind to the red cells and the white cells and form clots. And this is where you'll typically form a clot opposite the median divider at a bifurcation. And that's how you initiate atherosclerosis. And then endothelial precursor cells come along and they cover the top of it. I see this every day, multiple times every day, okay? So that's why hypertension over time worsens atherosclerosis. And then the more fat you have on board, the more the red cells are sticking together to begin with, and the more prone they are to forming these clots. But that's how hypertension causes atherosclerosis. So that's good to know, okay? And what I explained a moment ago was how fat causes atherosclerosis, sticking the red cells together. Hypertension does it by injuring the arteries and causing abnormal flow patterns. Okay, and also the high-fat diets will inhibit the endothelial cells from making the nitric oxide vasodilator. That's bad. Sodium inhibits the production of nitric oxide. That's bad. You don't want that. Okay, uric acid also inhibits these things. So like if you're drinking soda pop sweetened with high fructose corn syrup, the uric acid will also inhibit the production of nitric oxide by your endothelial cells. You don't want that. When you eat greens, you can get what are called external or exogenous nitrates. And here's how it works. The greens contain nitrates that are NO3. Okay, on the back of the tongue, there's bacteria that will convert them to NO2. This should be nitrites. That shouldn't be an A, it should be an I, nitrites. Okay, NO2. Then they go down into the stomach. The stomach acid converts it to nitric oxide, just NO. And then that goes into your blood, and that's a vasodilator. So you get systemic vasodilation. That's also why when you walk out in the sun, you feel good. Because the sunshine, it shines on your skin, and then right beneath your skin, subcutaneous, you have nitric oxide precursors, and they travel throughout your body, opening up arteries. So those are ways to get nitric oxide just from the external environment. And, we're made to walk around outside in extended family groups looking for food. That's what humans have done since the beginnings of humans on Earth. Okay. All right. So anyways, that's why some people will tell you, oh, you shouldn't, brush your teeth with fluoride toothpaste or use mouthwashes like that because they'll kill the bacteria on the back of the tongue. And then you won't be able to make this first conversion step from NO3 to NO2, nitrate to nitrite. And that increases your risk of hypertension. That's actually true. Also, proton pump inhibitors blocking your stomach acid will block the second conversion step from nitrite NO2 to NO. So that can also contribute to hypertension. Okay, and then this is why if you ever study Caldwell-Esselstyn, he recommend the patient eat a lot of greens in the daytime, okay? And that was to get more of this exogenous nitric oxide conversion to keep flowing into your arteries. That's what that's all about. Okay. He didn't need to do that in his initial results. That was later when he came up with that as a way he felt was helpful. All right. Every cell in your body has these plasma membrane. That's the outer lining of your cell. Sodium, potassium, ATP pumps. So the ATP pump is a form of energy in a cell. It's like a $20 bill in the cell for getting stuff done. every ATP pump is going to have a magnesium related to it because you need magnesium to run an ATP pump. It pumps out 3 positive charges, sodiums, pumps in 2 positive charges for potassium. Sodium is abbreviated Na, that means natrium, that's the Latin for sodium. And potassium is abbreviated with K, K plus, and that means kalium, that's the Latin for potassium. And what this is really doing is it's building up an electrical battery of energy. It's pumping a current because you're pumping more positive charge out than in. So there's a net flow of positive charge outward across like a capacitor, which is like the plasma membrane. There's a charge differential on one side than the other. The inside of the brain cell, for example, is negative 65 millivolts. So what that means is the negative charge inside of it. It means that the sodium that's outside wants to come in because it's attracted to the negative charge. It has a positive charge, so it's attracting to the negative charge. It's also 10 times higher in concentration outside the cell than inside the cell. So that's called a chemical concentration gradient. So you build up this big sodium electrochemical gradient, and that becomes useful later because if you allow the sodium to come into the cell, that can be coupled to this thing here that's like a water wheel, like a rotating door in a big hotel or something, to simultaneously pump out the calcium. And you're going to want to do that. I'll explain why in a moment. But so the energy for the gradient was generated by the ATP pump over here, but then it's coupled to letting the sodium come back into the cell so you can get that calcium out. That's going to be important. Okay, magnesium, is remember M for mellow. It actually calms the brain down, magnesium. And M is also, I think of it as being kind of like a hero. Magnesium hangs on to the second and third phosphate in ATP, and it prevents that third phosphate from taking off prematurely. It doesn't let it take off until it needs to. Okay, so here's how a brain cell really does business. Normally, the amount of calcium inside the center of the cell is very low. And literally, it's 10,000, 15,000 times higher outside the cell. And the amount of sodium outside the cell is 10 times higher than inside the cell. The way you can remember that is imagine that life began probably in the ocean. And what is the ocean full of? The ocean is full of salt water. So it's going to be high in sodium. And then the waves, they smash against the rocks, which are made out of calcium carbonate, the limestone, and they rinse calcium into the water. So the extracellular space is like the ocean. It's going to be high in sodium, salt water, high in calcium, okay, from going against the rocks. That's important to know because you want to keep the calcium and the sodium out of the cell. They're allowed to come in at certain times when you need the cell to do something. I consider calcium like the aristocrat. It's real bossy, okay? So I consider calcium like my ex-wife. She comes home and starts bossing everybody around. Calcium walks in and says, do this now. I thought I told you to pick up the dishes, to take out the garbage, to clean up the dog piss, to clean the garage, okay? Yes, dear, okay? You got to do whatever calcium says, okay? So I just tell you that is when calcium comes in, it's the boss and it tells you what to do, all right? And so in order for a cell to react, though, it has to be able to turn itself on and off because calcium coming in is like flipping on the light switch. But the cell is also going to have to do repeated activity, so it has to be able to turn that off. And the way it turns that off is it pumps calcium out of the cell. But, make no mistake about it. Calcium is the boss. It is the ion that makes something happen. The potassium and the sodium are just like the workers, okay? And sodium in particular really wants to come in. Let me in, let me in, okay? So when it needs to, it says, okay, fine, come in. And in an effort, it couples it to pumping the calcium out. That's how a brain cell does its business. And it has to do electrical things very fast. Imagine you're training for boxing. You're hitting the speed bag. Pop, 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 pop. Every time my hand goes out, that means I'm having the neurons fire for extension of my elbow. But when I pull it back, I have to relax all those neurons. And you have to do that super fast. This little pump here can pump out thousands of calcium in a second. It's incredible, okay? And I'll tell you something, that's another reason why I believe in God. I've been studying biochemistry in great detail for over 40 years, and it's so incredible. It's so millions of miles beyond anything a human could do. It's amazing. They built all these tiny little machines, nanometer size, that do incredible things, all right? But anyways, okay, let's go on to the next slide here. All right, so here's showing a cell. Again, here's the concentration gradients, 10 to 1, 10 times more sodium outside the cell. Potassium is sort of like the opposite of sodium. It's 10 times higher inside the cell, okay? Here's a brain cell, the neurotransmitters. Glue is for glutamate, diffuses across. It actually causes sodium to come in first through the AMPA channel. Then it binds to something called the NMDA channel. And this doesn't open up until the sodium has first entered to depolarize the cell, basically, getting it ready. Magnesium initially blocks the calcium channel, but once it becomes more closer to 0 in charge rather than negatively charged, the magnesium will pop out of this channel and the calcium will flow in. Okay, that's normal neuronal transport. Things that are bad for the brain will overactivate this channel. Like I talked to you about the effect of the voltage-gated calcium channels from holding your cell phone to your head, from eating the glyphosate will activate this receptor. It's a coincident detector, but glyphosate activates it. Aspartame, the sweetener, will activate that. Okay, high-fat diets, they lead to an increase in something called beta amyloid protein, which also activates this receptor. All those things that let more calcium into the brain cells unnecessarily in an unnatural way, they're all bad. Okay, so you don't want that. And this is what I talked about earlier, the K factor. You know, Richard Moore says at a minimum, you want a K factor of at least 5 to 1, 5 times more dietary potassium than sodium. Like I said, if you're eating starches and fruits, you're going to have like probably 15, 20 times, 25 times more potassium. So it becomes a non-issue. Like I said, too, there's tons of things that increase cytoplasmic calcium. You don't want that. Okay, here's a mitochondria. It has an outer mitochondrial membrane, the black OMM, in intramembranous space, IMS, an inner mitochondrial membrane, IMM, the green, and a mitochondrial matrix in the center, that's the yellow, okay? This is where energy is made. 90 to 95% of your energy comes from this little machine inside your cells, the mitochondria, okay? It passes electrons down this gradient of electron grabbers. The ultimate acceptor of electrons is oxygen. It's got a very powerful ability to grab electrons. They pass these electrons down like a snowball rolling down a hill. It's like a fireman bucket brigade. And what the cell does, this is what I was referring to about these cells. You know, the design of these cells is like, it's beyond genius. It's so incredible. It basically takes hydrogens off the original glucose molecule that you ate in your food, and then it takes the hydrogen atom and it splits it apart. It takes the proton, that's the center of the hydrogen nucleus, and it pumps it into the intramembranous space, the positively charged proton of hydrogen nucleus. And then it takes the electron, the peripheral orbiting electron, so it splits the atom, and then it passes that electron to a series of progressively stronger electron grabbers. And this generates energy. And then it's pumping these protons into the intramembranous space. It's a little bit like pumping compressed air into a canister, and then you harvest it by allowing a proton to come back into the mitochondrial matrix, and that energy will spin the ATP synthase. Again, it spins like a wheel, and that's coupled to adding a phosphate to ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to make adenosine triphosphate for energy. And these are what you need to run those sodium potassium pumps like I was talking about earlier, like a $20 bill in a cell. The gradient on this thing is incredible. It's like negative 160 millivolts. Like, holy crap. That's the highest gradient of anything in the human body. It's incredible. And the reason I'm showing this to you is things will block that, like dietary fat, okay, can block that. Like especially saturated fat from animal foods, and that causes diabetes. You don't want this. It'll block it right around here between coenzyme Q and complex 3. It'll start to back up, and you'll have all kinds of metabolic problems, okay? Oh, and there's a whole bunch of other things. We don't have time to get into all this, but there's a whole bunch of other things that can block it too. A lot of them come from processed food. That's why I don't eat any processed food. Okay, here's insulin binding the receptor on a cell. After you eat a meal, most of it should go to your skeletal muscles, okay? The majority of your prandial means eating, postprandial glucose should be taken up by your skeletal muscles and made into glycogen. Some will go to be made into glycogen in the liver. Some of it will just travel around, go all throughout the body, including the brain, but the majority of it should be going to the muscles. What happens is when insulin binds the receptor on the skeletal muscle, it causes these glucose type 4 transporters to move from the cytoplasm of the cell up to the plasma membrane, merge with the plasma membrane, and then they form channels that allow glucose to enter the cell. That is normal situation, what should happen after you eat. So eating is prandial. This is normal postprandial glucose uptake in the skeletal muscle. Now, if you got a lot of saturated fat on board, it gets absorbed faster than the glucose, and it gets into the skeletal muscle faster than the glucose, and it will block electron transport. The cell calls that overnutrition, and it'll shut down the glucose type 4 transporters. So it will block, this is called overnutrition. It will now block these glucose type 4 transporters from going to the plasma membrane. So the glucose can't get into the cell, and that's not good. So now you'll have high glucose in the blood. So you just ate, that's postprandial, and the word for high glucose in the blood, anything with emia means in the blood. So that's postprandial hyperglycemia. And, you know, it'll be excessive. You don't want this, okay? So it's another reason why you want to eat low-fat diets. All right, that's kind of like the story of diabetes, is where is the fat going? It starts out accumulating in the muscle. Intramyocellular lipid in the skeletal muscle is the first cause of insulin resistance and diabetes, and that'll cause high glucose levels in the blood after eating, postprandial hyperglycemia. You then accumulate fat in the liver. That causes fatty liver. And once you get fat in the liver can no longer accurately sense blood glucose. So now it'll release too much glucose into the liver in the fasting, and too much glucose will be released into the blood during the fasting phase. And now you'll have fasting hyperglycemia. So you check a fasting blood glucose in the morning, it'll be high in a diabetic, like over 125. Okay. So you don't want that. High fat diets should just cause problems. You'll accumulate fat in the pancreas and the beta cells, and they'll become dysfunctional. And then you get all these secondary complications of diabetes, going blind, heart attacks, kidney failure, impotence, blockage of the arteries in the foot, amputations. I see all this stuff every day, nonstop. I can also tell you something. I also was an imaging guided surgeon. I'm triple boarded. I'll get a phone call, residents doing a procedure in this room, residents having a problem. Can you come over and help them out? Or another senior doctor attending is having a problem. Can you come help them out? And they'll tell me the patient is so-and-so, 60-year-old patient. By the way, I'm, like I said, 61 going on 62. But in a regular patient, the typical American patient, I don't even look in the chart. I automatically know. I don't have to look in the chart. That patient will probably be overweight. That patient will have hypertension. That patient will have diabetes. And that patient will have coronary artery disease. It is so common that the patient has those diseases. I don't check the chart. I just assume, I automatically assume. That is a safe assumption. It would be rare that they don't have it. Sometimes it'll mention diabetes and not hypertension, or hypertension and not diabetes, but that's probably because they forgot to put it in the chart, okay? That's how common those diseases are. They're like the gateway diseases. Typical American is the same story all the time. Hypertension, diabetes, leading to atherosclerosis, plugging up the arteries of the heart, plugging up the arteries of the brain, progressive cognitive decline, okay? I look at a CAT scan for dementia, almost always the patient has poor dentition, they don't take care of their teeth, they've had cataract surgery, one or both of their eyes, and their brain's all shrunken and atrophic. I see that all day long. Next, and they start falling down as they get older. I get all these histories from the emergency room. Fell, hit head, BHT, blunt head trauma, fell, hit head, rule out, bleed, nonstop every day, and especially in the afternoon. It all percolates towards the emergency room in the afternoon. Okay, we don't need to go through this slide. This is more detailed mechanisms of brain failure. Here's one you need to know. This is a sea squirt. Sea squirt, when it's a juvenile, swims around like a tadpole. It's got a brain. And then when it's an adult, it attaches to a rock, becomes a filter feeder. And then its brain is reabsorbed, because you don't need a brain if you just sit around. Okay, Voltaire had asked, why do animals have brains but plants do not? Because an animal moves. As soon as you move, you have to make a choice. I will pick this destination, okay? I want to go to the fruit tree, get something to eat. You have to navigate. You have to avoid obstacles. You have to remember how to get back. Okay, so what I'm saying here is use it or lose it. You got to keep moving. As you get older, you should try to exercise every day. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. You should at least try to do some walking. Challenge yourself a little bit. When you're at home and you go to the bathroom upstairs, whichever one's a little bit farther away. Walk in a circle around the room or something. Just do whatever it takes to keep yourself moving a significant amount, so you keep that ability as you get older, because the body's got limited resources. If you don't exercise a little bit, the body says, why should I keep all these mitochondria? Why should I waste all these resources? The person never uses them. You'll just lose them, and you might not be able to get them back. So you don't want to ever lose them. This is showing the mechanism of leaky gut. Normally when you eat fiber, dietary fiber, which is all of the plant foods have fiber, by the way, there's zero fiber in meat, and there's very little in processed food. The fiber is your friend. The fiber feeds the good gut bacteria. They got these smiley faces. This is the gut lining, enterocytes, because the gut's called the enteric tract. And the good bacteria convert the fiber into something called butyrate. It's a 4-carbon fatty acid. It's a special type of fatty acid. Just call it butyrate. Goes into the enterocytes. They make it into TJs, tight junctions. And that prevents any bad stuff from getting across the gut lining. If you don't eat enough dietary fiber, or if you're exposed to these things that are toxic to the gut lining, like alcohol, emulsifiers in processed food, glyphosate on processed food, all of these things can damage the gut lining. The fluoride and the aluminum in unfiltered tap water, they can damage the gut lining and break apart these tight junctions. And then bacterial endotoxins like LPS, that's the endotoxin of gram-negative bacteria. LTA is the endotoxin of gram-positive bacteria. They can get across the gut lining, they can get into your blood, and they cause blood clotting. Also, the normal butyrate, it travels from the gut up to the brain, and it helps to maintain the blood-brain barrier. So dietary fiber protects your blood-brain barrier, and that protects your brain from toxic chemicals. So that helps protect you from dementia. Okay, here's what happens when you get the LPS and the LTA, bacterial endotoxins, in the blood. They will cause the blood clotting protein, fibrinogen, instead of being secondary protein structure of alpha helix, it'll change to being beta pleated sheet, flat like a deck of cards. And then when it's like a deck of cards, they'll stick together. And the bigger a molecule is, the higher its molecular weight, the more likely it is to precipitate out of aqueous solution, the water solution of the body. And to precipitate in blood means to clot. And so these little clots can form, and they can start plugging up arteries all over the body. When a protein changes secondary protein structure from being alpha helix like a slinky, a cylinder, to becoming flat like a deck of cards, beta pleated sheet, that's called an amyloid transformation. So this is called amyloid clotting. Some people call it fibrinoid clotting. And I actually think that this is much more common. Viruses can cause this to happen. I think this is much more common than is widely recognized. I actually think that this is contributing to the increasing incidence of atrial fibrillation and dementia. Also, being iron overloaded. In the Western world, men tend to become iron overloaded by the time they're in their 20s. Women tend to become iron overloaded by the time they're 60. They're postmenopausal and they stop menstruating. So what this is about is, normally iron is kept bound to binding proteins in the blood, transferrin, intracellular, and something called ferritin. Okay, but when you keep accumulating excess amounts of iron, it starts breaking free, going on its own. Iron is like a fire. You know, in your house, you want a fire in the fireplace, the furnace, to keep you warm. You want a fire on the stove to cook your food, but you don't want fire anywhere else, or it'll burn your house down. You don't want that. So what I'm saying is, iron is what's called a transitional metal. It has a variable valence, meaning it can hand off electrons freely. So that's useful in an enzyme active site as part of a chemical reaction. But you don't want iron just hanging out in the breeze in the blood, because it'll start doing what is called ferrous redox cycling, going back and forth between Fe2 plus Fe3 plus, Fe2 plus Fe3 plus, and it'll just release electrons to whatever chemicals are floating past, and that can also interact with the fibrinogen and cause this amyloid clotting. Okay, if you want to look up the research on this, look up Douglas Kell and Etheresia pretorius. So Douglas Kell is a PhD from England. She's a PhD from South Africa, and they both did big work on this. And it's something you don't want. When you have a lack of butyrate because you had a lack of dietary fiber, you're going to get leaky gut, leaky blood-brain barrier, and then you get these bacterial endotoxins, and they can get through into your blood, and they can even get access to some of the periphery of your brain. And you don't want that, because when they come into your brain, the immune system works by feeling things. It's like Braille, like a blind person. It'll bind to LPS or LTA. And as far as the brain guard cells, the microglia they're called, when they bind to LPS or LPA, they're like, uh-oh, incoming bacterial invasion, clear the area, and they'll release all these toxic chemicals to kill what they see as an incoming bacterial invasion. And the neurons that are adjacent to that area, they'll be damaged, collateral damage, due to these toxic chemicals. So the best way to handle this is to avoid it in the first place. Eat your dietary fiber, filter your drinking water, avoid glyphosate, okay? Soy tends to be the cheap protein put into processed food. Avoid the processed foods. Okay, this is just a hydroxynonenal, the toxic aldehyde, like what I was talking about from the omega-6 cooking oils. This is showing endocrine disrupting chemicals. There's a lot of these feminizing chemicals. Number one, they make good preservatives, something called like parabenzoic acid. And so there's a lot of these chemicals, like atrazine is one of these chemicals, endocrine disrupting chemicals. This guy, Gil Cirolini, did a lot of research on endocrine disrupting chemicals. By the way, just to give you a little perspective, I've read really 6 books on endocrine disrupting chemicals. I was very interested in the subject. And the bottom line is they're all bad. Okay. This is another reason why I don't like soy. I don't like flax. I don't want to eat any of this estrogenic stuff. Okay. And that's why I filter my water. I don't even use shampoo. I don't got much hair, but all the shampoos have a couple of estrogens in them. All the perfumes and colognes. I don't use deodorant. I think all that stuff's a bunch of garbage. I'm a minimalist, okay? Like when you walk in a room, what do you say to a person? Hey, how you doing? You don't sniff their armpit like a dog. What do you need deodorant for, okay? The worst is a spray-on deodorant, because you spray the deodorant, some of it's inhaled in your nose, goes through your olfactory nerve, which goes right next to your brain memory center, your hippocampus that we talked about earlier. These chemicals are toxic, okay? There's always going to be an estrogenic preservative. You look at breast cancer, it used to be about 25% in the upper outer quadrant. Now it's about 55, 60%. And it's one of the reasons I think it is because people put all this deodorant in their armpit with the aluminum as a metalloestrogen. It stimulates the estrogen ductal cells. And then the estrogenic preservatives like the parabenzoic acids, they're transdermally absorbed because like dissolves like in biochemistry, your skin is mostly lipid. And then what do a lot of people do? They shave their armpits. That increases transdermal absorption. So you're throwing like Miracle Grow on top of your upper outer quadrant of the breast, and that increases dramatically a woman's risk of breast cancer. So anyways, I just try to avoid all these things as best I can. I think the way you want to live, to the extent that you can, is kind of be like Adam and Eve, but keep your indoor heating and plumbing, just keep life simple. All this modern stuff is bad, most of it. Oh, this is my theory of dementia. So I call it the Peter Rogers, MD, theory of dementia, the supply and demand theory of dementia. So where it starts out with is very much like, Jack Delatorre's vascular hypothesis. You have a brain cell's baseline metabolic rate, and then you have oxygen and glucose delivery. If you tie off the carotid artery like he did, you will drop the oxygen and glucose delivery plus any of those diseases, congestive heart failure, atrial fibrillation, etc. All right, but I started adding a bunch of things to it. What about all the stimulants? So if you drink caffeine, you increase the metabolic rate of the neuron. The wider this gap, the more likely this brain cell is going to go into apoptosis and die. Caffeine, corticosteroids, psychological stress, sleep deprivation, MSG, MFG, aspartame, glyphosate, beta amyloid protein, attention deficit medications. You're widening this gap. You're looking for trouble, okay? Now, the next thing is we talked about, you have to pump that calcium out of the cytoplasm in order to shut off the activation of this neuron, which means you need good mitochondrial function. Well, I started looking up mitochondrial function. I was going to be a biochemist before I decided to become a medical doctor. And so I own like 7 biochemistry books, nutrition biochemistry books. I went through all of them. There was nothing, zero, nada about mitochondria inhibitors. I'm like, this is bullshit. This can't be true. I said, I got to go through the literature. So I started going through the literature. I literally found 100 mitochondrial inhibitors, and many of them are very common. And so what I'm saying is, if you inhibit your mitochondria, you can't make ATP. And if you can't make ATP, then you can't pump the calcium out effectively. And you're going to keep widening this gap because the neuron's going to have a higher metabolic rate. It's going to be overactivated. And then you're going to be losing brain cells. So how do you minimize all these problems? Be simple. Eat the low-fat, low-sodium vegan diet, 100% whole foods only, organic if it's anything where they might be spraying glyphosate on it or atrazine. Get your sleep, get some sunshine, get your rest. It's good to be religious. Religious people are a lot healthier, have some important sense of purpose in your life because that makes you more resilient. Get along with people as best you can, your family, your friends, your coworkers, to lower your stress level. All these things improve health. And that's the diet to prevent hypertension and diabetes and atherosclerosis. So all that protects you. And if you protect against those things, you'll dramatically lower your risk of atrial fibrillation or congestive heart failure. Okay. So that's pretty much the big overview. There's tons of things that are toxic to your mitochondria. And again, filter your water to remove, ideally get a reverse osmosis to remove the fluoride and the aluminum. At least get a carbon filter to remove the estrogenic chemicals in your water and a lot of other unknown toxins in your water. Minimize your dietary sodium, but more importantly, increase your plant foods to get that K factor of potassium. Those are all the things, that'll make you healthy. And I'll just tell you one thing a lot of people say to me, they go, well, I know this guy, my uncle or my friend's uncle, he smoked, he drank, he slept with hookers, and he stayed out late at night, and he lived to 95. What do you got to say to that? And what I would say to that is, look, some people, they can, if you took a bunch of blind people, okay, and you had them cross a busy street, 100 of them, okay, some of them would make it. Okay, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea. You want to do what increases your odds, gives you the best chance of having a good, long, happy life and being healthy. It's no fun being sick. Okay, so the baseline, the main part of your diet should be these starches. That should be as much as 90% of your calories is what, Dr. McDougall would recommend. Okay, I eat actually probably about 60%, maybe, 50 to 60% of my calories from starches. And then I eat a lot of fruits. I exercise a lot, so I'm pretty healthy. If you exercise a lot and you're healthy, you can eat more fruits. Then I probably eat about 5% of my calories from vegetables. Like I said, Dr. McDougall is one of the greatest nutrition doctors who ever lived. He recommends eat 90% of your calories from starches. And when you're starting out, that might be a good idea. If you're pretty healthy and you exercise a lot, you can eat more fruits. Fruits are a little bit of a pain in the butt, though, because they're more expensive. They don't store as well. Starches is pretty easy to store them. They're pretty cheap. You can buy them in bulk. Potatoes, sweet potatoes, rice, beans, oatmeal, quinoa, wheat, all that kind of stuff. Single ingredient pasta. Carrots are kind of a starch. Okay, and then we talk about the social stuff. Usually people are pretty good at that. Religion helps. Religious people are a lot healthier. That's under-recognized, but it is true. As far as B12, I take methylcobalamin. I wouldn't take cyanocobalamin because, what is cyano? That means cyanide. Okay, and they go, well, it's such a small amount of cyanide. I'm like, well, you know what? I don't want any cyanide. Eventually, you'll need that if you become 100% vegan. So that's it. That's pretty much sums it up.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Rogers. I appreciate this so much. And